It was not the kind of evening New York usually offered to those who didn't belong to its upper floors. The streets were damp from an afternoon drizzle, the air tinged with the smell of wet asphalt and the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts sold from the corner cart on East 72nd. Elijah Torres tightened his jacket around him, balancing the weight of the insulated delivery bag against his shoulder. He'd been riding for 9 hours, weaving through traffic, listening to the impatient growl of yellow cabs and the sharp hiss of buses pulling into stops. He didn't know her name yet. All he had was an address. And a tip amount that made him blink twice when he saw it pop up on his phone before the ride, something absurd for a simple dinner drop-off. Most people didn't tip like that unless they'd clicked the wrong button, or unless they lived in a world where numbers didn't mean the same thing. The lobby smelled faintly of lilies. The kind of lilies you don't find in a bodega, but flown in from somewhere with a name you can't pronounce without practice. The doorman's suit was pressed so clean you could almost see the stitching in the low, golden light. He didn't ask Elijah for ID, just looked at him in that way that measured people without a ruler, deciding in half a second where they fit in the invisible map of the city. Upstairs, the elevator opened to a hallway so silent it felt like stepping into a library where every book was bound in leather. He found the apartment, knocked, waited. When the door opened, she didn't look at him the way customers usually did, distracted, halfway scrolling through a phone, already thinking about the food rather than the person holding it. Her eyes locked on his as if she'd been expecting someone entirely different, and for a flicker of a second, something unreadable passed across her face. "You're not what I expected," she said. Her voice carried no hostility, only curiosity, like she was trying to match his presence to a mental photograph she'd been holding all day. "I'm just the delivery guy," he replied, unsure why the words came out softer than intended. "And you're—" She hesitated, as if answering that question meant stepping into a different version of herself. Then she smiled, not the polite kind strangers give, but the slow, measured smile of someone who knows their answer will shift the ground beneath the conversation. "I'm the one whose life is about to get a lot more complicated," she said. It should have ended there, the handoff, the thank you, the closing door. But it didn't. Because when she took the bag from him, her fingers brushed his, and for reasons neither of them could have predicted, neither moved away right away. And in that moment, Elijah realized there was something unspoken in the air, the kind of tension you feel when you're standing too close to the edge of something you can't yet see the bottom of. And the truth? He had no idea that by the end of the week, this woman, whoever she really was, would make him question everything he thought he understood about where he belonged in this city, and about the cost of saying yes to the wrong invitation. The next time Elijah saw her, it wasn't because of another delivery. It was 2 days later, in the same neighborhood but under a completely different sky. One of those brittle late autumn afternoons where the sun seems to hang low just to remind you how short the days really are. He was off shift, his bike chained outside a corner cafe, nursing a coffee he couldn't really afford to sip this slowly. He noticed her before she noticed him. The coat she wore looked like it could have been tailored for her alone, a soft, warm beige that caught the light in ways a camera could never quite capture. Her hair was pulled back, a subtle gold glint threading through the strands when she turned her head. She was talking to someone older, a man whose presence seemed heavy in a way Elijah couldn't name. The man touched her arm, speaking low, his tone somewhere between persuasion and warning. She didn't answer right away. She just looked past him, and that was when her eyes landed on Elijah. For a heartbeat, she didn't react. Then something shifted. A small, almost imperceptible relief softened her expression, as if she'd just spotted an exit in a crowded room. She murmured something to the man, quick, almost dismissive, and started walking toward Elijah. "You're hard to miss," she said, pulling out the chair opposite him without waiting for an invitation. Her voice carried the faintest tremor, but her smile tried to smooth it over. He raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure I'm the easiest person in this city to miss." "That's where you're wrong." She leaned in, elbows on the table, studying him as though they'd met years ago and she was searching for traces of the boy he used to be. "You remember what I told you? About my life getting more complicated?" He nodded slowly, the coffee cooling between his hands. "Yeah, I remember." It's already happening. She glanced over her shoulder, just enough for Elijah to catch sight of the man she'd been with, now watching them from across the street. And you're not supposed to be part of it. Which means you're already part of it. There are moments when the city seems to fade, the chatter, the cars, the constant low-grade hum of urgency. This was one of them. Elijah felt as if the table between them was the only solid thing left. You're not making sense, he said, though something in him already suspected she was making more sense than he wanted to hear. My name's Charlotte, she said finally, her voice dropping. My father runs things. The kind of things you don't talk about over coffee in public. I'm supposed to meet someone this week. It's not a date. It's an arrangement. And the man you saw. He's here to make sure I don't forget that. He let the words settle, the unspoken weight behind them pressing in. And what does that have to do with me? Her eyes held his, unwavering. Because I think you might be the only person in this city who would tell me the truth. And I need the truth right now, even if it ruins everything. Something in her tone, the crack just under the surface, reached him in a way he didn't expect. He had spent years in this city being overlooked, underestimated, measured only by the weight of the bag he carried. And now, here was someone who saw him not as a delivery guy, but as a choice. The man across the street lit a cigarette, the flame briefly catching in the reflection of a car window. Charlotte didn't look back at him. She kept her eyes on Elijah, as if willing him to understand the stakes without her spelling them out. You really think I can help you? He asked. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. No. I think you're the only one who might want to. And in that moment, without meaning to, Elijah knew he'd already said yes. Not with words, not yet, but in the quiet way people step towards something dangerous before realizing how far they've gone. What he didn't know was that by the time the week ended, the question wouldn't be whether he could help her, it would be whether he could save himself. The night air tasted different when you were being followed. Elijah wasn't sure at first. Maybe it was just the echo of footsteps bouncing off the narrow walls of the alley behind his apartment building. But when he turned left instead of right, and the sound turned left with him, his suspicion hardened into certainty. He didn't run. Running in New York after dark was like setting off a flare. You drew attention you didn't want, and the wrong kind of people always noticed. Instead, he kept walking, hands deep in his pockets, head down like any other guy heading home after a late shift. The footsteps kept their distance, but not far enough. When he reached his building, a converted brownstone with peeling paint and a front door that stuck when it rained, he unlocked it without glancing over his shoulder. The hall smelled faintly of dust and boiled cabbage from the neighbor's perpetually simmering pot. He waited by his apartment door, counting the seconds. 5. 7. The faint sound of the front door opening again. He turned the knob and slipped inside, locking it fast. The silence on the other side of the thin wood stretched, then faded. Whoever it was had decided to leave, or to wait somewhere else. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, you shouldn't have talked to her. He stared at the screen, the words sinking in like ice water in his veins. He didn't answer. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about Charlotte, about the way her eyes had scanned the cafe like every exit was a calculation, about the way her voice had carried something urgent she couldn't quite say out loud. The next morning, he woke to another message from the same number. Coffee. Noon. Same place. Come alone. No name. No punctuation beyond the period. He should have ignored it. Every part of him knew this was the kind of invitation that pulled you into things you didn't walk away from unchanged. But noon found him at the cafe anyway, nursing the same table by the window. She arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a dark green scarf that made her look like she'd stepped straight out of a colder, quieter world. You came, she said, as if it surprised her. I was curious. Her mouth curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. Curiosity gets people in trouble where I'm from. He leaned forward. Then why invite me? Because trouble's coming anyway. And I'd rather have someone sitting across from me who doesn't already have an agenda. the words hung between them like smoke. He thought of the man from the other day, of the messages on his phone, of the fact that Charlotte was clearly part of something much larger than she was letting on. "What exactly is it you want from me?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and slid something across the table, a folded piece of paper, edges creased from being handled too many times. He unfolded it slowly. Inside was an address, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Underneath, just 3 words, "Do not tell." His pulse quickened. "What's there?" Her gaze didn't waver. "The truth." It was the kind of answer that should have clarified everything, but instead it only made the air between them heavier. He wanted to push, to demand details, but something in her expression told him that whatever he didn't yet know was dangerous in a way he couldn't measure. Outside, a black sedan idled by the curb, its engine low and steady. Charlotte noticed it without turning her head. She stood, sliding her scarf back into place. "Be careful, Elijah," she said quietly. "Once you see it, you can't unsee it." And then she was gone, swallowed by the city's motion, leaving him at the table with nothing but a piece of paper and the sound of his own heartbeat, faster now than it had been all morning. He had no way of knowing that the address in his hand would lead him to a door that should have stayed closed. Elijah had tried to ignore it, tossing the folded paper onto the chipped wooden table in his apartment like it was nothing more than a grocery list. But every time he walked past it, his eyes snagged on the sharp edges, and the weight of those 3 words, "Do not tell," pulled at him like a magnet he couldn't escape. By morning, the sky over the city was the color of cold steel, and a wind from the river cut through the streets like a blade. He wrapped his scarf higher, tucked the paper into his jacket, and told himself he was only going to look. Just to see. Just to satisfy a curiosity that had been gnawing at him since Charlotte slid it across the cafe table. The subway ride was longer than he expected. The stops grew quieter, the faces more unfamiliar. By the time he climbed the cracked concrete steps out into the daylight, the Manhattan skyline was a faint suggestion on the horizon. This neighborhood wasn't built for visitors. The building at the address stood out for all the wrong reasons. A squat, brick warehouse with boarded-up windows on the 2nd floor and a heavy steel door at street level. There was no sign, no number, no welcome. He hesitated on the sidewalk, pretending to check his phone as he scanned the street. 2 men leaned against a car half a block away, their conversation too quiet, their eyes occasionally flicking in his direction. They didn't move, but they didn't need to. Their presence was a warning. Still, Elijah stepped forward. The steel door had no handle, only a narrow slit like a mail slot. He knocked. A pause. Then the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened just enough for a single eye to appear. "Who sent you?" His mouth went dry. "Nobody. I'm looking for someone." The eye studied him, unblinking. Then the door shut again. For a moment, Elijah thought that was the end of it. But the bolt slid back once more, and this time the door opened wider. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through dusty skylights. The air smelled faintly of oil and paper. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the shadows, lined with boxes marked in black ink. A man stepped forward from the gloom. He was older, his hair silver at the temples, his suit immaculate in a way that didn't belong in this part of the city. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, a quiet authority that made Elijah's skin tighten. "I got this address from Charlotte," Elijah said, the name slipping out before he could stop himself. Something flickered across the man's face. Recognition. And something else. "She shouldn't have done that," the man said. "Do you have any idea what you're standing in the middle of?" Elijah shook his head. The man reached for a box on the nearest shelf, sliding it toward him. "Then you'd better understand before it's too late." Inside the box were photographs, stacks of them, bound with twine. Elijah untied one bundle, flipping through image after image of people he didn't know. Some were smiling, others frozen mid-motion, all caught in moments that felt too intimate for strangers to possess. Every one of those faces, the man said, is part of the same story. And Charlotte is the last one who hasn't disappeared from it. The words landed like stones in Elijah's chest. Why show me this? He asked. Because she's already chosen you, the man said simply. And that means you don't have a choice anymore. Outside, the wind rattled the loose siding of the building, a sound like distant footsteps. Elijah glanced toward the door, but part of him already knew, walking away wouldn't make any of this disappear. The city felt different after that day, like every streetlight and shadow was in on a secret he wasn't meant to know. Elijah spent the night pacing his apartment, the photographs burned into his mind. Strangers' faces that somehow felt connected to Charlotte's, to the man in the warehouse, to those quiet figures who had watched him from half a block away. He didn't know their names, but the weight of their absence pressed on him like an invisible hand at the back of his neck. By morning, his phone was buzzing again. Another unknown number. You have something that doesn't belong to you. He stared at the screen, feeling the invisible web tightening. He'd left the photographs in the warehouse, but the address, the memory, the man's warning, those were his now, and whoever had sent the message knew it. At 9:10, there was a knock on his door. Not the hesitant kind, but sharp, deliberate. He opened it to find Charlotte, her coat zipped to her chin, her eyes darker than he remembered. You went, she said. Not a question. He stepped aside, letting her in. Why give me the address if you didn't want me to? I wanted you to see enough to understand. Not enough to make you a target. Well, he said, too late for that. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to glance outside. They've been watching me for months. I've learned to live with it. But you. She stopped, biting the inside of her cheek. You don't know how fast this can get ugly. Elijah crossed his arms. Then tell me. All of it. No more hints, no more cryptic warnings. Who's in those photographs? Her gaze met his, and for a moment, it was like she was deciding whether to trust him with something that could never be taken back. Finally, she spoke. They're people who tried to walk away, she said softly. From my father's world. From deals they thought they could undo. Some owed money. Some knew too much. None of them were meant to disappear. But they did. And you. I'm next, she said, almost whispering. Unless I agree to what they want. The words settled heavy in the air. Elijah wanted to ask what they want, but deep down, he knew the answer wouldn't be simple, or safe, or anything he could fix. Before he could speak, a car engine roared outside. Charlotte froze. Elijah went to the window, catching sight of the black sedan pulling up to the curb. Two men stepped out, both in dark coats, both scanning the street with slow, deliberate movements. They're not here for coffee, Elijah muttered. Charlotte grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Then you need to decide right now if you're in this with me, or if you're going to pretend we never met. It wasn't a choice that felt real. Not when the thud of footsteps was already coming up the stairs. Not when the knock at his door was harder, sharper, the kind of knock that didn't wait for permission. He looked at her. She looked at him. And without speaking, they both knew. The decision had already been made. The second knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a fist, heavy, impatient, vibrating through the thin wood like a warning shot. Charlotte's eyes darted to the fire escape window. Elijah understood without words. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, shoved the folded piece of paper with the warehouse address deeper into his pocket, and moved toward the window as the pounding on the door grew louder. They climbed down fast, the cold iron rattling under their boots. Below, the alley smelled of wet brick and old oil, steam hissing from a vent somewhere in the shadows. By the time their feet hit the pavement, a voice was calling from inside the apartment. Low, controlled, but edged with something that promised it wouldn't stay controlled for long. Charlotte didn't slow. She led him through a maze of narrow streets, cutting between buildings, doubling back twice before ducking into a small diner whose neon sign flickered like it had been half dead for years. Inside, the smell of fried onions and burnt coffee wrapped around them. A waitress with tired eyes and a pencil stuck behind her ear waved them toward a booth in the back. "You trust this place?" Elijah asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "I trust the noise," she said, nodding toward the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation. "Here, nobody notices anything unless you make them." For a moment, they just sat there, breathing hard. Then Elijah leaned forward. "Tell me why they're after you." No more half-truths. Charlotte's gaze locked onto his, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no trace of performance in her voice. "My father has an arrangement," she said, "with people who don't put things in writing. Land. Money. Promises. I was supposed to marry into one of those families to seal a deal. I said no. That was my mistake." Elijah frowned. "People don't send black sedans after you for just saying no." She hesitated, then lowered her voice even further. "I know what's in those boxes at the warehouse. The photographs. The files. I wasn't supposed to see them. But I did. And now they think the only way to protect themselves is to make sure I can't tell anyone. And me. You're the first person I've met in months who isn't already tangled in their world," she said. "That makes you dangerous to them, and to me." The waitress dropped 2 mugs of coffee between them, the steam curling upward like smoke. Charlotte wrapped her hands around hers, staring into the dark surface as though it might hold the map to her next move. "You still have that address, don't you?" she asked. Elijah nodded slowly. "Then you have something they can't let you keep." A shadow passed over the neon glow from the window, blocking the light for just a second. Elijah glanced outside. The sedan was back. Only this time, the engine wasn't running. "They found us," he murmured. Charlotte didn't turn around. She reached across the table, her fingers closing around his wrist. "Listen to me. If you want to walk away, you do it now. Once we leave this diner, there's no coming back to the life you had before." Elijah looked at her hand on his, then at the window, then back at her. And for the second time in a week, he realized he'd already made the choice long before she asked the question. They didn't leave through the front door. Charlotte led Elijah to the back of the diner, past a narrow hallway lined with faded photographs of baseball teams and mayors whose names no one remembered. At the end, a battered metal door opened into the alley, the hinges shrieking in protest. The cold night air hit them instantly, along with the muffled hum of the city beyond. She didn't speak until they were 2 blocks away, their footsteps quick but measured. "If they follow us now, they'll try to box us in. We have one stop to make before they do." Elijah kept pace beside her. "Another address." Her lips tightened. "Not exactly. A person. Someone who knows how to make things disappear. Not people. Just evidence." He didn't like the way she said just evidence, but he didn't argue. They reached a pawnshop that looked like it had been here since the city was still building subway tunnels. The windows were dusty, and a flickering bulb hung above the entrance. Charlotte knocked once, then twice more in quick succession. The man who opened the door was broad-shouldered, wearing a stained apron over a flannel shirt. His eyes went from Charlotte to Elijah, then back again. "You shouldn't be here." "They found me," Charlotte said simply. The man exhaled through his nose, stepping aside to let them in. Inside, the air smelled of metal and old wood. Stacks of boxes and shelves of mismatched electronics filled the small space. "I need a safe way out," she said. "And I need him to have one, too." The man shook his head. "That's not how this works. He's already in it. You're either both in, or you're both gone." Charlotte glanced at Elijah. "We're both in." The man disappeared into the back room. A few minutes later, he returned with a small envelope, sliding it across the counter. "There's a storage locker 2 neighborhoods over. Inside is something you can use, but only once. After that, you're on your own." Elijah picked up the envelope, feeling the slim weight of a single key inside. "What's in the locker?" The man's gaze held his for a long moment. A way to buy yourself time. And time is all you're going to get. They left without another word. Outside, the street was quieter now. Too quiet. Elijah noticed the sedan parked half a block away, its windows dark, no movement inside. Charlotte leaned closer. They're not going to wait much longer. Then let's not give them the chance. They turned the corner and didn't look back, but Elijah could feel it, the invisible line tightening between them and the car, pulling them closer to something they couldn't yet see. The storage locker was in a low, concrete building that smelled faintly of mildew and engine oil. A tired-looking clerk barely glanced at them as they walked in. Elijah slid the key into the lock of Unit 17, the metal groaning as the door rolled upward. Inside was a single object, a worn leather briefcase, its edges scuffed, the handle wrapped in black tape. Charlotte stepped forward, resting her hand on it like she already knew what it held. "This belonged to my mother," she said quietly. "She kept records of everything my father did, every deal, every payment, every person who disappeared. He thought they were destroyed. They weren't." Elijah stared at the case. This could ruin him. "It could ruin a lot of people," she said. "That's why they want me gone." Before he could respond, a sound cut through the stillness, the low growl of an engine outside. Charlotte's eyes widened. "They found us." He grabbed the case. "Then we move." They ran through the back exit, their footsteps echoing in the narrow service corridor. Outside, the cold air stung Elijah's face, the briefcase thumping against his side with each step. He could hear doors slamming somewhere behind them, voices shouting. Charlotte pulled him into another alley, their breath visible in the air. "We get this to someone who can protect it, and we disappear." "Who?" he asked. She hesitated, then said a name he didn't recognize. "She's a reporter. Old friend of my mother's. If we can get this to her, it all comes out. And once it's out, they can't bury it." The sound of footsteps drew closer. Elijah looked at Charlotte, at the fear in her eyes and the determination just beneath it. "This doesn't end clean," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it ends." They slipped out of the alley and into the current of the city, swallowed by the movement of strangers who had no idea how much weight one worn briefcase could carry. And somewhere behind them, in the dark mouth of the alley, the men in the black sedan stood watching, their patience running out. The city had its own heartbeat, and tonight, Elijah could hear it in the soles of his feet. Every block they crossed felt sharper, the streetlights harsher, the gaps between the cars longer and hungrier. Charlotte kept a steady pace beside him, the briefcase gripped so tightly in his hand that his knuckles ached. They didn't talk at first. Talking meant slowing down, and slowing down meant giving the black sedan time to catch them. The crowd was thick enough on 8th Avenue that they could vanish for a few seconds at a time, but Elijah knew that didn't mean safety. It just meant a longer chase. Charlotte leaned in, her breath visible in the cold. "She's about 15 minutes away. But we can't go straight there. They'll expect that. Then what's the plan? We draw them out. Make them think we're going somewhere else, then double back. And if that doesn't work..." She didn't answer, and that silence was worse than anything she could have said. They ducked into a subway station, the tiled walls gleaming under the flicker of old fluorescent lights. The smell of hot metal and damp concrete filled Elijah's lungs. The platform was nearly empty except for a man in a denim jacket reading a newspaper and a young woman scrolling through her phone. The train roared in a few minutes later, its brakes screaming, doors hissing open. Elijah and Charlotte stepped inside, the sound of the city shifting into the rattling hum of underground motion. She sat across from him, eyes scanning the car, her hand resting just above the briefcase. "When we get to 34th, we switch lines. That'll buy us some." The words died on her lips. Two men had stepped into the car just before the doors closed. Not the same ones from the sedan, but close enough. Clean coats, eyes that didn't wander, the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly why they were here. Elijah didn't look at them directly. He met Charlotte's gaze instead, reading the tension in her shoulders. She slid her hand closer to the briefcase. The train rattled through the dark, station signs flashing by. At the next stop, they stood without a word, moving toward the far exit. The men followed, keeping just enough distance to look like commuters. Once on the platform, Charlotte's pace quickened. They took the stairs 2 at a time, then cut through a side corridor that smelled faintly of bleach. Elijah heard footsteps closing in behind them, and before he could think, he grabbed her hand and yanked her toward a service door. It was unlocked. They slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. The narrow hallway beyond led to another set of stairs, these ones climbing upward into a maintenance area. Pipes lined the walls, dripping occasionally into shallow puddles on the concrete floor. Somewhere above, the rumble of trains echoed like distant thunder. Charlotte pressed her back to the wall, breathing hard. "We can't keep running like this. We need to get ahead of them. Then tell me where the reporter is." "She's in a walk-up on the Lower East Side. Apartment 3B. That's not far from here. Far enough if they're on us." They moved again, slipping out through a side door that opened into a narrow street. The air felt colder here, quieter, the sound of the city dampened by the tall brick walls on either side. Halfway down the block, Elijah spotted the sedan. Its engine was running this time. "Charlotte, I see it." The driver's door opened, and one of the men stepped out. He wasn't rushing. He didn't have to. The kind of confidence that came from knowing the prey was cornered radiated off him. Charlotte's fingers dug into Elijah's arm. "Go." They sprinted toward the end of the street, turning sharply into a main road where the noise and lights hit them like a wave. The chaos of pedestrians and honking cabs gave them cover, but Elijah knew it wouldn't last. Finally, the Lower East Side came into view. Narrower streets, older buildings, the glow of small bars and corner stores casting fractured light on the sidewalk. They stopped in front of a building with peeling green paint around the doorframe. "This is it," Charlotte said. They climbed quickly, the wooden stairs groaning under their weight. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, both were breathing hard. Charlotte knocked twice, then once more after a pause. The door opened a crack. A woman in her 60s peered out, her gray hair pulled back into a bun. Her eyes moved from Charlotte to Elijah to the briefcase, and whatever she saw made her open the door wider. "Get inside." The apartment smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee. Piles of newspapers covered the small dining table, and a bulletin board on the far wall was pinned with photographs, notes, and maps marked with red string. Charlotte placed the briefcase on the table. The woman, the reporter, unlatched it without hesitation. Inside, stacks of neatly bound folders filled the space, each labeled with dates and names. She picked one up, scanning the first page, and her expression hardened. "This is enough to bring down half the people who think they run this city," she said. "That's the idea," Charlotte replied. But before the reporter could say more, a sound cut through the apartment. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy. Purposeful. Elijah moved to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to see the street below. The sedan was there. And this time, the men weren't waiting outside. "They're here," he said. Charlotte turned to the reporter. "You need to go. Now. Take this with you." The woman shook her head. "If I leave through the front, they'll see me. You two have to draw them away." Elijah looked at Charlotte. "We run again?" She shook her head. "No. We finish this." They moved quickly, sliding the briefcase under the couch and leaving the lid open just enough to make it look like it had been hidden in a hurry. Then they stepped into the hallway, letting the apartment door click shut behind them. The first man appeared at the far end, his coat swaying as he walked. Elijah felt his pulse pounding in his throat. "You can't stop this," the man said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Hand it over, and you can both walk away." Charlotte stepped forward. "You know that's not true." The man's eyes flicked between them, calculating. "Then you understand what happens next." Elijah didn't let himself think. He grabbed Charlotte's hand, yanking her toward the far stairwell. The man followed, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the narrow space. They burst out onto the street, the night colder now, sharper. A crowd from a nearby bar spilled onto the sidewalk, their laughter and chatter momentarily masking the chase. Elijah and Charlotte pushed through them, turning into another alley lit only by the yellow glow of a single bulb. Behind them, the footsteps quickened. They reached the end, a chain-link fence blocking the way. Charlotte glanced at Elijah, her breath clouding the air. Up. They climbed fast, the metal rattling beneath them. Elijah hit the ground on the other side, reaching up to pull her down. She landed hard, stumbled, then caught her balance. Somewhere behind them, the sound of the fence shaking. They didn't look back. The alley opened into a side street where a yellow cab idled. Elijah yanked the door open, shoving Charlotte inside before climbing in himself. "Anywhere with traffic," he told the driver. The cab pulled away just as two figures appeared at the alley's mouth. One of them lifted a phone to his ear, his expression unreadable in the shadows. In the back seat, Charlotte leaned her head against the window, her breath finally beginning to slow. The reporter will know what to do. Once it's public, there's no taking it back. Elijah nodded, though he knew the truth. Making it public didn't mean they'd be safe. It just meant the rules would change. The city rolled past outside, all neon and shadows and 1,000 lives crossing in every direction. Somewhere in that maze, a woman was unlocking a briefcase and setting in motion something too big to stop. Charlotte glanced at him, a faint, tired smile on her lips. "You could have walked away." He looked out the window, the glow of the streetlights sliding across his face. "I think we both knew I wouldn't." And for the first time all night, she let out a quiet laugh. The kind of laugh that carried just enough hope to make the darkness feel a little less heavy. The cab turned a corner, disappearing into the blur of the city, the sound of its tires on wet pavement folding into the endless heartbeat of New York. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.